Okay, welcome everybody to this final talk of the FSU History Department Speaker Series of the year. I'm very delighted to say that we are joined today by Amy Leonard. Amy Leonard is Associate Professor of History at Georgetown, where she works on the Reformation and on female sexuality in early modern Germany. She is also an expert on virginity during the Reformation and an expert on Catholic conceptions of virginity. Now, Dr. Leonard has lots of publications. I've chosen just a few to highlight here. Debating the Reformation, the 16th Century Journal from 2018, and of course her book, Nails in the Wall, Catholic Nuns in Reformation Germany, which was published by the University of Chicago Press. Dr. Leonard is working on a new book called The Reformation of Virginity, the Views of Female Sexuality in Reformation Europe. And I believe we're going to be hearing a portion of that. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
And I will not say any more. We are delighted to have you here. If everyone could please join me in the reaction round of applause here. I will turn this over to you, Amy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Max, and thank you to the whole history department for inviting me. Though I am very sorry not to be able to come in person to Florida. I think I told Max that I grew up in Gainesville, Florida. And so whenever I think of FSU and Tallahassee, it's always colored through a Gator's eyes. So I just want to be upfront with that from the beginning, that that's how I see FSU, which I know is not usually how the faculty see it, more like the students. But just beginning with that. So this talk is part of a larger project, as Max mentioned, that's comparing the changing views of female sexuality before and after the Reformation. I started out thinking that I was going to look at all of sexuality in terms of women and gender, but more and more it's come to focus specifically on virginity, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm pulling this talk from various chapters, and then it's going to range a bit widely, chronologically, and a bit geographically, but I think it's still, I hope it all will hold together. I'm basing it in a variety of sources, including religious propaganda and treatises, letters, sermons, convent chronicles, hagiographies, literary and artistic works, and conduct literature. I'm sorry, Kathy McClive isn't here yet because I haven't started looking at medical texts, and so I'm hoping to actually talk to her about some of those and get some hints of some discourse that I can find in that at some point. I know these are all kinds of different genres with different audiences, but I'm trying to get at sort of a discourse of virginity in the way that it's used in different areas by different people throughout this period. So the study of virginity offers a window into the Reformation and changing views of women and gender. Protestant propaganda and attacks on Catholicism were often expressed in sexualized terms, and both Protestants and Catholics were intimately concerned with what went on in the bedroom. Protestants attacked Catholics for their sexual debauchery and hypocrisy, and Catholics responded by accusing Protestants of unrestrained lust, claiming their clerics were too weak to remain celibate and chaste. And these are classic 16th century woodcuts. On the left, there's the debauched nun and a very sort of romantic embrace with a monk, and then clearly Protestant propaganda. And then on the right is Luther being whispered in the ear by some devil. And so these would be the sort of fighting propaganda using devil, sex, other kinds of rhetoric against them. All confessions wanted to control sexuality, especially female sexuality, though their rhetoric and methods differed, with church and state working together to regulate marriage and sexual patterns. Studying virginity more closely shifts this discussion a bit. Putting virgins and virginity at the forefront of a study can refocus our views of sexuality, which have too often been male-based and generally defined by sexual acts. And this, looking at virginity, gives a woman, particularly non-sexual women, more of a voice. Virginity was a sexual category for both men and women, but it's generally defined by the woman. Putting virgins and virginity at the forefront of a study can refocus our views of sexuality and give women more importance. Scholars often emphasize the negative aspects of virginity discourse. That is, how the ideal virginity undermined female sexual agency and made the body's intactness women's main defining characteristic. There's certainly much misogyny associated with male, especially church views of female virginity, but virginity can also be empowering, as seen in the lives and writings of numerous nuns, mystics, and other women. Ideas of virginity were embraced and denigrated throughout the 16th century and had various values for the different sides of the confessional debate. There was no one set view of virginity by either men or women in this era. Male, female, religious, lay, Protestant, Catholic, all used and manipulated discourses around virginity in their own way and for their own purposes. Actual physical virginity was hard to verify for women and impossible for men, so the virgin and virginity took on great metaphorical and spiritual power, which opens up new ways of seeing the effects of the Reformation in theory and in daily life. Now, before going any further, I want to start with defining some terminology. Chastity refers to behaviors and attitudes, habits of thought and practice vis-a-vis sex, a mindset, if you will, while celibacy technically just means the state of being unmarried, either never married or no longer married. I think in English today, we often conflate these or we flip them. But it's important in this time of that they mean different things, particularly chastity, which I think is misunderstood often in our own world. All Christians, in theory, were held to certain standards of chastity, which varied according to one's state of life. It doesn't just mean no sex. The unmarried teenager, the married person, the widower, the vowed religious were all obliged to certain forms of chastity. But the standards, constraints and freedoms, rights and obligations varied. The monk or nun took a vow of chastity, a stronger vow with more weight than the secular clergy's vow of celibacy. Celibate clergy, because you're not supposed to be having sex outside of marriage, celibacy is supposed to mean also no sex, but oftentimes it didn't. But chastity was sort of on top of celibacy as well. And so that this meant something stronger in behavior. Now looking at virginity or virgin, the German word for virginity is Jungfrau. This literally means young woman or maiden, which is also true in Latin, but it sort of loses that feminine aspect to it in English. And this generally needs a masculine qualifier when referring to men. So you would say Jungfrau männlich to talk about male virgins. In 16th century Germany, virginity, perpetual or temporary, monastic or lay, was more associated with women than men. It's true in everywhere. German sources on monasticism only ever refer to chastity, Keuschheit, for nuns, never celibacy. And even more often for nuns, their vow and way of life was referred to as perpetual maidenhood or Jungfräulichkeit, in a way you never see for men. Thus, virginity and perpetual chastity become completely wedded for religious women and was reflected in the convent hierarchy. So at the top, you have the elite tier of veiled choir nuns who sing the hours and are seen as the most elite and are reserved, except in very rare cases, for virgins. Widows and other non-virgins could only attain lay nun status. And you can see here in the costumes, they would have different habits, live in different parts, and usually the lay nuns do most of the manual labor and work for the choir nuns. So that virgin status really gives them an elite role within the convent. Only a virgin was worthy and pure enough to be a true bride of Christ. Virginity was a state of being, while chastity was chosen. Perpetual virginity, however, embodied both. In theory, it was a gift from God, but it became a choice that was superior to all others for women in the Catholic Church, representing a higher ideal and calling than marriage. So the virgin is gendered, both culturally and linguistically, as female. Rather than being virginal, men were more usually described as celibate, pure, or continent, terms which did not assume that no sexual contact had ever occurred. Writers did sometimes refer to virgins in a gender-neutral way, and there were men who were particularly known for their virginity, such as St. Joseph or St. Emmerich of Hungary, who was often painted with a white lily, which is the symbol of virginity. But it was unusual and was not really their claim to fame. Men had more avenues to sanctity than sexual purity, whereas for holy Catholic women, it was often their defining characteristic. There wasn't just one type of virgin or virginity. Virginity had meaning both for the individual in a physical and spiritual way, and symbolically for society at large. The physical bodily definition is the most basic. A virgin is a woman who has not had sex, proven by her intact hymen. And yes, we all know that that's not a particularly accurate way of telling whether someone's a virgin, but they would be checked, and this would be something that would be used in this period. Everyone was born a virgin, but the designation only really began to matter after puberty, and usually only in reference to women. The most basic category of virgin was the young maid, post-puberty, but before marriage. And you can see from this image, we know that she's a maiden, a young maiden, because she has her long hair is down, not up, as a matron's would be. She has a low bodice showing off her cleavage, which in a certain period of time would also mean that she is sort of on the market. And so she's young and fertile and ready to go as sort of pre-marriage maiden. There's a second category of virgins who never marry or entered a convent, generally viewed as spinsters or old maids. And these virgins held a very precarious position in society, looked upon with suspicion, and always just one step away from whoredom. A third type, as I've already mentioned, embraced virginity and became perpetual virgins, choosing, in theory, to remain unmarried for spiritual reasons. These women were often associated with an enclosed religious community, though not necessarily. And finally, there were what I'm calling born-again virgins. So those whose virginity had been restored through penance and redemption, faith or divine intervention. And so I can go on and on about Mary Magdalene because I won't, but she's actually not a prostitute in the Bible, but she's always sexualized in this way, but then she's also redeemed. And I love this middle image where here she's a saint now, she's been redeemed, but she has a very knowing look in her eyes. And so, this is somebody who has known sin, but has been reborn and redeemed as a born again virgin. And there is actually even discussion that God can physically bring back your hymen and can make you truly a virgin again through his power. The idea of virginity is fundamental to Christian doctrine, since the miracle of Christ's birth is based on a virgin conceiving. And I love this image of God blowing the Holy Spirit into the Virgin Mary on the right. You can sort of see it's just coming down as a straight line from him. And so this is the way the virgin conceives. Protestants who attack perpetual virginity, particularly as a way to undermine female monasticism, could not completely negate its power or role. How to value Mary and the virgin birth while still invalidating virginity as a vocation was a perilous task capable of possibly shaking the entire foundation of the religion. Protestants used three specific arguments to undermine virginity: that it was not natural, that it was near impossible to maintain with numerous examples of people breaking it, and that it actually was not the essence of the religion. Mary was the exception that proved the rule. That's what made it a miracle. To see her as a model to follow was a profound misreading of the event. But there was a type of religious virgin that both Protestants and Catholics could embrace: the metaphorical virgin, symbolizing the body of the church. This metaphor of church as the virgin wife married to Christ was one that both Protestants and Catholics agreed on and used. And Protestants and Catholics agreed in other ways too. Both took as obvious that the virginity of a maiden was a necessary precursor to marriage. Where they differed, however, was with the spiritual perpetual virgin, the woman who took a vow to become the bride of Christ. This virgin, who came under withering attack from Protestant reformers, appeared in full form by the 3rd century and became a key part of the sexual hierarchy for Christian women. At the top, the virgin, then various states of non-virginal chastity, such as the widow or the chaste wife. After that, everything else was some form of deviant sex: fornication, adultery, prostitution, same-sex relations, pedophilia, bestiality, etc. Early Christian writers and medieval theologians discussed and dissected all these types of virginity, often focused on female purity and how women could overcome their inherently sinful nature. Numerous church fathers wrote lengthy treatises on the topic, some to the point of obsession. And I've highlighted here St. Jerome, who really was obsessed with virginity, particularly for women, although it's talked about with men as well, and had a lot of letters with nuns talking about how important it was for them to remain virgins. The praise of virginity and its elevation above marriage marked a distinct difference between Christianity and previous classical and Jewish cultures. The pre-Christian world saw perpetual virginity as abnormal. Virginity was rather a temporary state before marriage. Even those who embraced it as a vocation, like the Vestal Virgins or the Essenes, did not view it as desirable for large numbers to follow their example. In Peter Brown's words, it was an elaborately contrived suspension of the normal process. Perpetual virginity would not have been an acceptable choice for most non-Christians, even if they had been given that choice. Christianity transformed that into an ideal in theory, if not in general practice. It's still going to only be for a small proportion of society, but it's set up as better than everybody else. German Protestant views on the subject were similar to pre-Christian ones. It's not normal, and were overwhelmingly negative. There are some differences with England that I can't really get into right here. As Luther famously expressed, women are ashamed to admit this, but scripture and experience show that only one woman in thousands has the God-given gift to maintain pure chastity. Rather, a woman is not the master of herself. God fashioned her body so that she should be with a man to have and to rear children. Here you see one of the main critiques of virginity. Its precarious nature, especially for women in the cloister. Women needed marriage to protect them. The early Augsburg convert Bernhard Rehm maintained that nuns endangered their own salvation by remaining virgins. Writing to his daughter and sister in the convent, I have no idea if that's actually the convent, but it is a convent in Augsburg, so I'm circling it. He warned that the cloister offered no protection from the devil and no help against the temptations of the flesh. You are in great danger with many enemies around you. The first enemy is the devil, who can deceive you better than outside the cloister in the married estate, because the convent life is an idle life. Where one is idle, the devil has room and control to suggest all sorts of evil thoughts to people. A wife and a mother was so busy caring for her family that she had no time to be beguiled by the devil. Early reformers felt that the vow of chastity had denigrated the estate of marriage almost beyond repair, and took it upon themselves to save this institution from attack by directing censure at the monastic institutions and, by extension, perpetual chastity in general. We see the precarious position of the Virgin reflected in popular literature. Numerous German songs and poems illustrated the perils of virginity and how difficult it was to protect. In the 1535 song, A Swabian Had a Daughter, a naive peasant girl, too sure of herself and her purity, goes to the big city and loses her virginity, making it impossible for her to marry. The virtuous Lady Alda, featured in a 1570 poem, embraced her virginity with sad results. She was, quote, she was dedicated to purest chastity, with no man would she be mated. From young men she did flee, which grief and woe brought in the end, end quote. Refusing to follow her family's advice on marriage, she clung to her virginity. Her downfall came when she fell in love and secretly married a ne'er-do-well. She lost her honor, her faux husband denied the marriage, and she was ruined. Though based on a medieval tale, the song took on new resonance in a Protestant world which viewed virginity so suspiciously. The song emphasized the need for both marriage and parental consent, and provided an object lesson for how precarious virginity was. Marriage was the only way to stay sexually safe. German pamphlets, religious treatises, and popular works emphasized over and over again marriage. Though popular literature often mocked it, especially the nagging, shrewish wife, Protestant moralists praised it on high. Unlike the heroic virgin one can find in some English literature, Germans more often have a moral tale about the chaste wife, who battled great odds to maintain her honor. For example, the story of Susanna from the Bible was a popular theme and used to show the proper behavior for women. Germans praised virginity, but not for its own sake, but rather just as a precondition for marriage. In Hans Sachs's Good Advice to Young Men, he presented a man with three choices for a wife. First, the pure virgin maiden. Second, the young widow, married only once before. And third, the old widow, married twice before. He advised, of course, choosing the maiden. By this he means the maiden kind would still be timid, tame of mind. The worst choice, of course, would be the sexually experienced older widow. It's hard to teach old dogs the new. You with this hag both day and night would have a tug of war to fight. As I've said, the virgin was never safe until she became firmly ensconced in marriage. I think one reason Protestants, especially during the early Reformation, focused such hostility on virginity was their need to attack the monastic life and justify its dissolution. They had to convince people of the futility of perpetual chastity and virginity. The Protestant rallying cry of "be fruitful and multiply" received a great deal of lip service during the 16th century, but it was more complicated to actually transform society to embrace it fully. One early area we see this discussed in detail was in the avalanche of anti-clerical attacks in Germany. These attacks, which began before the Reformation and in which both laity and clergy participated, had pronounced sexual overtones. And so here again is the one I showed before of the nun and the monk. And then the other one on the right was a very popular one from before the Reformation officially begins, with the rope maker coming home to find his wife again in bed with the monk. And so clearly, sexual debauchery among the secular clergy and religious was an extremely popular theme. These are very popular woodcuts that people will buy cheaply and have around. And most agreed, both within Germany and other countries, that religious and sexual misconduct went hand in hand. Although many charges were made about the cloistered life, its futility, elitism, and financial exploitation, sexual debauchery tended to have the most resonance, especially against the nuns. Even that defender of Catholicism, the German satirist Thomas Mörner, couldn't resist a few digs at the nuns and their sexual frustrations. He suggested in The Great Lutheran Fool that nuns be allowed to leave the convent, have a bunch of sex, quote, romping and rolling around, end quote, get it all out of their system, and then return to the cloister happy and satisfied. I use any opportunity ever to show the penis tree, because it is one of my favorite medieval images from the Romance of the Rose. And so showing that mocking of nuns in the convent was not something only done in the Reformation. It's a little different because they're not attacking the entire system. They're not saying close the monasteries, but they clearly are having fun with this sort of sexual frustration of nuns within the convent. Protestant countries seem to revel in the tales of misconduct in the monastery. The nuns' supposed debauchery was such a trope in England that Hamlet's advice to Ophelia, get thee to a nunnery, was widely understood to mean the brothel. The formal monastic visitations that Henry VIII instituted in 1536 read like a police blotter from a crazy Vegas weekend. Every abbot was a masturbator, fornicator, and sodomite. Every nun was pregnant, and every cemetery filled with the murdered offspring of the convent's liaisons. There were so many pregnant nuns, they had to be broken down by category. Nuns pregnant by priests, by canons, by laymen, nuns pregnant voluntarily or through carelessness. One wonders how that happens. Although they were also accused of superstition and having unmanageable debts, the most powerful charge for closing these houses all over Europe was often sex. Obviously, this is exaggerated for effect and propaganda, but it's clear that many, if not most, thought these were realistic findings. I want to turn now to focus a bit on Martin Luther, the most prolific and infamous German reformer. Luther's views on virginity must be read within the context of his criticism of the Catholic Church and monasticism in general. But they tell us more than just how he felt about celibacy and perpetual virginity. They get at the heart of his view of gender roles, especially for how women should be protected and confined within the private domestic sphere. Luther strongly differentiated between chastity and virginity, always praising chastity more. He emphasized the voluntary aspect of chastity, the hallmark of any good marriage, and refused to accept perpetual virginity as a freely chosen vocation. But as I said before, he had to walk a careful line where he condemned the virginity of the Catholic Church and its nuns, but still praised Mary and the virgin birth of Christ. He also wanted to value virginity more than Judaism did, which he claimed dismissed it as barrenness. This led Luther to a tripartite view. The first part saw virginity as a metaphor for the church, which for Luther was the only acceptable form of spiritual virginity rather than physical virginity. This metaphor had nothing in common with the second wrong kind of spiritual virginity, the false and corrupt elitism of monasticism and the nuns. The final, and for Luther, the most important aspect of virginity was in its bodily sense, as something precarious and vulnerable for the majority of women in their lived reality. The fragile nature of female virginity meant that for Luther, the best virgin was a married one. Looking first at spiritual virginity. Spiritual virginity for Luther was not associated with the body, but rather included all of Christendom. It was the entire church, based in faith and the soul. It was not gendered or sexed. This kind of virginity was no special province of women or any way to gain status or respect in the temporal realm, as the Catholics argued. Instead, it denoted every Christian. As the church is gendered female, so too this kind of spiritual virginity. Though ungendered, Luther did more easily conflate this virgin with women. So as the church is gendered female, so too is this spiritual virgin female as well. This virgin was the true bride of Christ, not the nun, but she, like the physical virgin maiden, was sexually vulnerable. Now the devil seeks to seduce the bride so that she will lose her chastity and virginity in which she was betrothed to Christ. The sexual metaphor continued with faith. For the soul is called a spiritual virgin and a bride of God only because of faith, by which it receives the word of God and becomes pregnant with the Holy Spirit. The pure virgin was the faithful Christian, but association with the corrupt Catholic Church sullied this true Christian, leading to her fall from the virginal state. This whore, who before was a pure virgin and dear bride, is now an apostate, erring, married whore, a house whore, a bed whore, a key whore, being the mistress of the house, having the key, the bed, the kitchen, the cellar, and everything at her command. Yet she is so evil that beside her, the common unattached whores, the pimp whores, the whores of the field, the country, and the army are almost holy, for she is the true arch whore and the true whore of the devil. If you've ever read Luther, this is pretty much where he's coming from. By classifying the female virgin as a universal for all Christians, Luther could use his favorite gendered sexual slur, whore, to attack the Catholic Church. Anyone at odds with true Christianity was sexually deviant. Therefore, faith is the spiritual virginity through which we are married to Christ. Thus, Jews and bad Christians and the prophets are always accused of fornication, that is, unbelief. And I'm using this picture to remind everyone that Luther was a monk. I mean, Luther came out of this monastic world. He was an Augustinian friar. He wrote this about fornication and virginity before the official beginning of the Reformation. And so he knew what he was speaking about, which is why the Catholics attack him, that he just couldn't keep celibate himself. And so that's why he had to break from the church. So those who fail in their faith fall into adultery, in Luther's words. Luther complained that virginity had become a spiritual commodity when its true worth was only of this world. Thus they have made a trade out of virginity, hoping to gain something with it before God, not being satisfied with the temporal advantage of chastity and the eternal gain of faith. Luther also defined virginity as a commodity, but one tied to marriage, not salvation. Virginity was a woman's best dowry, in his words. It gained its greatest power for Luther right after marriage as the token of exchange between bride and bridegroom, representing her purity and worthiness. For the feeling of love in a bridegroom is most tender and impatient, especially at the very moment of marriage, when the embrace and the nuptial joy are at hand. Obviously, this picture is after the nuptial joys and she's pregnant, but I do love this image of married life. Only in that moment did Luther truly see virginity as active, but only as it benefited the man. It was still a passive commodity for the woman. This was a virginity of potential, and its loss was ruinous. If someone should take your money, gold, silver, and cattle, it is a small loss, but to take a virgin, a beautiful and beloved wife, from whom you expect offspring with your whole heart, and from whom you hope for the seed of the promised descendants, this is surely a wrong, an insult that surpasses all wrongs. In this way, virginity only had meaning in relation to marriage and procreation. Luther prized most this material value of virginity, one which fit within his larger focus on marriage. He criticized the traditional Catholic hierarchy of chastity that put the virgin on top, above married people and the widowed. Since virgins existed in all religions, how could they have some spiritual edge that makes them better than everyone else? Virginity and marriage were states of being, not belief. They were stations of life, in life created by God. He separated out an individual spiritual virginity, remaining a virgin without lust, from the physical and more temporary state before marriage. To remain a spiritual virgin for life was nigh impossible because lust was so strong. One had to have a gift from God to mitigate it. And if one lusted at all, one's spiritual virginity was clearly absent or voided. Though Luther acknowledged this gift existed, he stressed that it was exceedingly rare. More often, he saw it as impossible. Quote, "There has never been either a virgin or a celibate in this life who has been without lust," he claimed. Anyone feeling carnal desires or experiencing fluxes and pollutions, as he says, clearly did not have the gift and should get married. In fact, the virgin was more sinful than the wife since she was fooling herself. Because her lust was not channeled and controlled by marriage, she was more in its thrall and beneath the married woman. This meant that the chastity found in marriage was far above virginity, in his words. This chastity was also private, a matter for the family, headed by the patriarch, not in the public eye, which is what he saw virginity in monasteries being. This domestic chastity was directly at odds with the monastic life. Because the loss of virginity was so tragic and unalterable for Luther, he believed that virgins need to be protected, just not the way the Catholic Church had been doing. He condemned what he saw as the rampant abuse of forced monachization, putting women in convents against their will, and the discourse of marriage as lesser than celibacy and perpetual virginity. He was particularly horrified by the acceptance of prostitution and civic brothels, and dismissed the argument that these were antidotes to homosexuality or the violation of pure maidens and honest matrons. Brothels did not protect women, since any man so immodest as to visit one would have no compunction about propositioning anyone else. Brothel scenes from this period always look like they're having such a great time. The only real protection for the virgin was to transfer her from the protection of her father to that of her husband. Defending the virgin benefited the future bridegroom too. Virginity was a dangerous time for women, but it also held perils for men. How could one truly know if your betrothed was untouched? As Luther says, who can guarantee or say that he is really getting a virgin? The road goes past the door, as they say, which I just find a really funny expression. A virgin must be removed from society, looking on no man, not even her bridegroom. She was in a waiting pattern until she mattered. Virginity's true worth and meaning existed more after it was gone, when the honorable maiden had married and had children. Then her modest upbringing and virginity had been positively fulfilled and literally brought to fruition, as opposed to the fallen woman who had sex outside of wedlock and came to ruin. Her virginity, her greatest commodity, was wasted. Thus the virgin must be hidden, protected, and as quickly as possible, married off. Luther discarded the traditional Catholic view of virginity as something better, having both physical and spiritual merit, and embraced one firmly grounded in the temporal world. For Luther, the virgin embodied potential. The state of virginity was a way station between too young to marry and should be married. Virginity was just the precondition of motherhood. The virgin was synonymous with unmarried woman or maiden, and the loss of virginity, if done appropriately, equaled marriage. Thus, virginity and marriage were conflated. The loss of one meant the procurement of the other. While Luther saw the state of virginity as a way station or only embodying procreative potential, many women saw it as a representation of their faith, community, and female sexual identity. Luther insisted they were wrong, and he sapped female virginity of all of its power. In his view, it was not an active agent. The only real spiritual virginity was universal, representing all true Christians, married or not. This disempowered those admittedly few who did get agency and a voice from their perpetual virginity. By refusing to accept that women could choose to remain virgins, he denied them an active sexuality separate from men and consigned them forevermore to the private domestic sphere. So for the final section of my talk, I want to now look at those virgins themselves and what did they think about their own virginity. My first book was on nuns, and I can never really leave them behind, so I have to bring them into every talk. I'm going to give some examples highlighting the power of virginity from the Middle Ages through the early modern period. And I want to focus here on those women who wrote about perpetual virginity as a saintly, positive choice and vocation, what I am defining as an active virginity. Now, whether the perpetual virgin life was a choice, a gift, natural or unnatural, something to be wished for or something forced upon a woman, was much debated throughout the pre-modern period. The male church's view of female virginity was often rife with misogyny. It undermined female sexual agency and made the woman's bodily intactness the most important aspect of her religious life. It focused on the female body as a negative to be overcome, which, if she were able to do so, purged her female nature, and in the infamous words of Saint Jerome, turned her into a man. And it is true that male authorities tried to use virginity to control the female body, but I would argue that women subverted this discourse for their own purposes. They created an active, specifically female virginity, an empowering force which could raise women to great heights. While Protestants wanted to disassociate virginity from Mary, the Mother of God, we see that the women who were most associated with it, cloistered nuns, were explicit in their belief that they were the inheritors of Mary's gift. Their virginity fought evil, gave its adherents power, and raised women to positions of authority, independence, and holiness. We see multiple examples of this pride from the Middle Ages through the early modern period. One of the most empowering, active descriptions of virginity comes from the 12th century abbess and all-around Renaissance woman, Hildegard von Bingen. Hildegard called virginity a primal sanctity, which made her independent. She was disassociated from a man, no longer under his care and power, and free from him. I am not bound by any obligation to a man. Virginity had the power to reverse, or at least mitigate, original sin. The worm-filled mud is the first root of original sin, which sprang forth through the wiles of the ancient serpent and which natural virginity choked off when the Son of God was born from the Virgin Mary. For Hildegard, virginity was the very root and foundation of all that was good. It was not just the exceptional Virgin Mary, but virginity itself that brought us back from the fall. Whereas Protestant reformers tried to separate out the active agent of virginity from Mary, she was an aberration, a miracle of God, her virginity incidental and without agency outside of that miracle, Hildegard and other nuns emphasized the power and utility of that virginity. Adam and Eve were brought low by sin, which for a woman was always connected to her wanton sexuality. Hildegard wanted to make it clear that it was another form of sexuality, specifically female virginity, that redeemed us. This gave women an incredibly powerful role in salvation and the birth of Christ beyond just his mother Mary. Virginity for Hildegard was not just empowering for the virginate herself, but for all women. For it was God who told the serpent that his head would be bruised by woman, because his beginnings were evil, so that the virgin was destined to trample him underfoot. Though the reference was to Mary, many nuns placed themselves in the same category, as chosen by Christ to fight evil in this world. The select position gave them certain benefits. When Hildegard was criticized for some of the strange customs of her nuns, like standing in the church with unbound hair, dressing in white, and wearing golden crowns, she replied, "These virgins deserve to adorn themselves in such a way. Why is she so resplendent? Because she was created by the finger of God, because she was endowed with wondrous beauty. Oh, woman, what a splendid creature you are, for you have set your foundation in the sun and have conquered the world." Married women could not indulge in such behavior except at her husband's pleasure, and even then with moderation. But these strictures do not apply to a virgin, for she stands in the unsullied purity of paradise, lovely and unwithering, and she always remains in the full vitality of the budding rod. I just wrote a scene here from this wonderful movie, German movie from 2009 on Hildegard von Bingen. And it's a big scene of when they're dressing with their hair down and in the white clothes, and other nuns are upset about them doing it. And so there's no image of that from the time, but I wanted to evoke it with this. As the bride of Christ, it was fitting she wore white vestments, as Hildegard said, the lucent symbol of her betrothal to Christ. The power of this kind of virginity was a collective one. Many nuns used terms of community and solidarity to describe their communal virgin status. The nuns of one convent in Venice referred to themselves as a, quote, total virgin family, and a consortium made up of virgins. The nuns were proud of their sexual state and wrote orations praising their chastity while denigrating marriage. This pride is perhaps somewhat ironic, since the orations come from the convent Le Virginie, where Guido Ruggiero famously showed the nuns were prosecuted multiple times for fornication between the 14th and 16th centuries and had numerous illegitimate children. The convent fought tooth and nail against any Catholic reform efforts, presumably because they wanted to be able to continue their sexually free lifestyle. So clearly not every nun wanted to be a virgin, though in some ways their official, if not real, virgin status was still empowering, since they got their way, even if they were not actually remaining virgins. The communal solidarity of virgins also came in handy when Protestants tried to shut their convents down, as we can see with the Poor Clares of Geneva. Evangelicals tried to undermine their calling and sexual status, describing the convent as a prison and nuns as, quote, poor blind women who strayed in their religion. The reformers urged the Genevan residents to throw stones at the nuns because of their debauchery, hypocrisy, and false virginity. When the city authorities tried to close them down and complained that they were making such a racket in their convents, the prioress replied, "Messieurs, this is nothing. You will hear much worse if you take us to your synagogue, because when we are all together, we will cause such a disturbance that we will have the upper hand." The convent will get closed, but they are able to push back for quite a long time. We see the same communal defiance in many convents throughout the Holy Roman Empire. These houses were on the front lines in the battle over reform, as the women within were told to convert and leave. And yet these women fought back, usually in greater numbers than their male counterparts, and often succeeded in remaining in their houses. Even as Luther transformed the way Protestants viewed sexuality, tying its licit and accepted expression completely to marriage, the nuns refused that reconfiguration. There was power in numbers, and the nuns' communal confidence was often explicitly tied to their virginal higher status, a state that transcended their physical form. Another example of virginity's power, though probably used more as a rhetorical device, came from the 30 Years' War. Maria Anna Unius, a Dominican nun in a convent outside Bamberg, described how the nuns' virginal status convinced the marauding Swedes to leave them alone. Although people spoke much evil of us, I can bear witness before God that not the slightest thing happened to a single sister from our convent, contrary to the preservation of her virgin status. Although the Swedes came and went daily here, they behaved at all times in a modest and respectful manner towards us. For if from time to time they approached like furious lions or bears, as soon as they had seen and talked to us, they all became as meek and gentle as lambs. She emphasized that their communal virginity was something the Swedish men were impressed by. Whereas Protestant reformers saw a woman's virginity as fragile and the reason a maiden must marry, these nuns viewed it as their ultimate protection. Obviously, nuns were vulnerable, and there are many cases where it does not end as well as this in the Peasants' War and in the 30 Years' War as well, but that's not my focus here. Other nuns also battled against the Protestant redefinition of virginity and its futility. The famed Poor Clare prioress in Nuremberg, Caritas Pirkheimer, agreed with Protestants that not everyone had the ability to keep complete chastity. We confess that maintaining chastity is not given to everyone by God. It is also not denied to everyone. If one could not maintain it, then all the wives whose husbands are often away for a long time would not be pious. God did not want this, however. Christ made it clear enough to us which state is the better one. If marriage were such a good thing, then Christ could well have taken a wife. I love here the little sort of dig at the family, the men of the city of like, what's happening when you're away with your wives. Nun writers made an effort not to specifically condemn marriage, emphasizing that perpetual virginity was the gift of a few and should not be forced on anyone. As Caritas explained, we also do not despise marriage, for we know that whoever marries does the right thing. But according to the teachings of St. Paul, we also know that whoever does not marry does even better. In the event that we decide to serve God as virgins, truly no intelligent person can hold that against us. If, however, someone is not so inclined or does not want to join us, we have nothing against that. Note here the clear emphasis, this is a choice, freely made by the woman herself. In fact, while the perpetual virgin could seem transgressive and against the norm, remaining a virgin in a world where the majority got married, she also supported marriage and the patriarchy. By emphasizing the nuns as brides of Christ, with the chastity expected of any wife taken up a notch to intact virginity, the nun could lose her more radical qualities and become just like any other wife, submissive and part of the patriarchal norm. And this is the famous marriage of St. Catherine to Christ. That at least is how church authorities often spoke about these women. For the nuns themselves, though, being the bride of Christ with an absent and yet omnipotent patriarch gave them a confidence and authority not really intended by the church. They were protected by their groom. And it's interesting that they are brides, not wives. The marriage is never consummated, though for some mystics it is, but that this is sort of the potential virginity still, never consummated. And no one can touch them. As Hildegard wrote, quote, "Those who persecute and torment virginity so that they bring tribulation upon it will not escape God's vengeance," end quote. Her heavenly spouse would defend her honor. I've spoken here about the empowering aspects of perpetual virginity. Even though nuns frequently emphasize their inferior status as poor, meek women, it's clear the confidence and power they felt in their vocation. From Hildegard to Caritas to Teresa of Avila, the continual reference to, "Oh, poor little woman that I am, I'm so ignorant," is such a rhetorical trope that it loses all literal meaning and clearly denotes just the opposite. But in the end here, I want to emphasize again the exceptional nature of it all. The virgin gained power and authority, but this avenue was not open to all women. Hildegard, ever the elitist, was clear that sexual purity was tied to social status. In her words, One does not plow with an ox and an ass. A lower order will not gain ascendancy over a higher one, for God establishes ranks on earth just as in heaven, and they are all loved by God, although they are not equal in rank. The virginal life might be empowering, but only for those who already had some power to begin with. We cannot separate gender from class. The vast majority of nuns were elite, able to afford the convent dowries and fees, and while there were beguines, beatas, tertiaries, and others living outside convents who came from the lower strata, they often were seen as a problem by the church, or more of a problem than the nuns, and did not have the same security and authority as the cloistered nuns. The world of perpetual virginity was a world mostly inhabited by noble elite women. Just as Luther and others argued Mary was an exception, so too were women like Hildegard and Caritas. These women transcended their female inferiority, but they were unusual. Their extraordinary nature actually reinscribed the carnal, sexualized, unempowered world of the average woman, at least in the eyes of the church discourse. In conclusion, looking at virginity in this sustained way particularly affects the history of women. Views of sex and sexuality were very male-based before and during the Reformation. The phallus ruled, and licit versus illicit sex was defined by its procreative value. Many claimed women were created solely for reproduction. Their needs, desires, and identity were not often taken into the equation in the prescriptive literature. This male focus explains the religious and legal preoccupation with penetration as defining sex, and the relative disinterest in female same-sex relations. Scholars of the history of sexuality and queer studies initially reinforced this male emphasis with studies primarily on men. But recent work has broadened the question and pushed scholarship to understand pre-modern sexual identity more broadly from a multi-gendered perspective. Virginity has too often been the forgotten stepchild in this history of sexuality. While discussed and noted, especially for differences between Catholic and Protestant theology, it is usually couched in terms of shunning normal sexuality and not taken seriously as a category of its own. But this misses an opportunity. Because virginity has so many manifestations, physical, metaphorical, symbolic, spiritual, and represents something both inherently biological and socially constructed, it becomes a blank slate on which historical actors could express their deepest sexual and societal views. Thank you. Now I will stop sharing.
I hope you all join me in a round of applause for Dr. Leonard, even if it is just the reaction button here. Now, what I thought we would do, we have a little bit of time here, and if you still have some energy, we'd like to field a few questions here.
Sure.
So what I think the best way to do this will be if you could use the raise hand function, which is distinct from the clap function. But if you can use the raise hand function to show that you have a question, I will keep a queue here and I will call on people. And then once you've spoken or posed your question, you can lower the hand. So why don't we do it that way? And I think the raise hand function is, oh geez, where is it?
In participants. So
Yeah.
It's in participants.
Yeah, if you're host, you don't see it. So only because you can't raise a hand as host.
Okay. Okay, so that's how we'll do it if anyone has a question for Dr. Leonard. I'll start, by the way. I'll take the prerogative of chair here, Amy. And if I may, I just had one question that immediately came up. I was really intrigued by, first of all, excellent talk, really a lot to think about here. I was really intrigued by your use of the phrase perpetual virginity as this way of referring to staying a virgin. I think it was with perpetual virginity of the perpetual virginity of Mary, and it being the physicality of her still being a virgin after giving birth. Mm-hmm. And this is something that perplexes me, and I'd love a little bit of information about this. As I understand it, Luther and Calvin and the Reformers, they hold to this, you know, vaguely Don Quixote-esque idea that, you know, Mary is still physically completely intact after giving birth, which of course the Catholics can explain because baby Jesus can walk through walls, and so he kind of just exits her. how does Luther square this? And Luther, Calvin, and these other first generation, or I guess Calvin's second generation reformers, how do they square this with their denunciations of perpetual virginity for the rest of us? Is it, to what extent can we say it's just Mary was unique? And to what extent does this reveal something about their thinking of virginity for everybody?
I think yes to both those. And so so for Luther, I mean, Luther loves Mary. I mean, he writes Magnificat, and, you know, loves the sermons for her and stuff. So it's very hard for him to kind of walk this line of not falling into sort of Catholic ways of thinking of her. And Luther, you know, remember, he's this medieval monk. He still has that kind of sensibility. And so both he and Calvin kind of wiggle out of it of, like, you know, God can do anything. So it's just a miracle of God that she remains a perpetual virgin, but it's something that she's so spectacularly different, and also she had nothing to do with it. I mean, there's no active agent from her at all. She's not a model for everyone, except as being sort of, you know, a nice matronly mother of Christ, and you know, being sad when he died. That's also a model. But they disassociate the birth of Christ and the perpetual virginity. They disassociate it from her body. I mean, it's something that is just spiritual in many ways that God has granted her, and that is perpetual. I mean, and they don't, and Luther won't accept that her mother is also immaculate conception and all that. I mean, so they don't accept that the mother was a virgin as well, but it's a little inconsistent, I would say. And I think that this is one part of the things I'm trying to get at with this study, of that looking at virginity and the way the reformers talk about it really gets at the way that they think about women and the way that they think about female sexuality, of that they're not comfortable with Mary having control over that. They're not comfortable with her having this powerful role in, you know, the most important event of Christianity, the birth of Christ. And so, well, maybe not the most important, but whatever, one of the most important. And so that they have to figure out ways of talking about virginity that denigrate women, and in fundamental ways. And I love Luther in a lot of ways, and I think that he's inconsistent. I think that he can say great things about women, and I think that he can also say incredibly horrific things about women. And so I think that he's conflicted on this. But I think in terms of female sexuality, there's a fear, and that virginity is worse than rampant sexuality. Because it's the negation of marriage and the family, which all the Protestants want, and because it sets them up. And so it's really important to put Mary in her place, of that Mary is nothing, it's all God, even if, you know, she's still this wonderful model, but it's because of God.
Okay, thank you so much for that. George, you have your hand up, so I will turn to you.
Okay, I want to make sure my thing's on. Okay. Thank you for the talk. This is really illuminating. I had a question, a couple of questions, but one is the Protestant reaction. How would you this is probably too big a question, but how would you compare Luther's reaction to virginity to his reaction to male celibacy? I mean, clearly the campaign was not only against convents, but also against monasteries. And so there had to be some parallel there, but I'm sure it's a parallel with a difference.
So yes, I mean, so he attacks male celibacy as much as he attacks virginity, but virginity, he has to, I mean, what I think is interesting is that male celibacy is just an easy attack. You know, male celibacy is wrong. Everybody should get married. Men, you know, cannot control their sex. They're, you know, wanting sex. Close down the monasteries. It's all fine. But you can't attack virginity in the same way, because virginity is still something that women have to do. And so that's why I think it's interesting looking at the virginity. It's a much more complex argument that he's making, and he's having to kind of separate out spiritual versus material versus perpetual. And so when he's attacking the nuns, I think that it becomes a more sophisticated argument than when he's attacking the monks, because the monks become so personal too, because it's like, I know just like you, and I know that it's impossible. I know what happens in the monastery, and you can't do all of this. But it's a very kind of cut and dry of what he's talking about that fits very easily into his marriage argument. But with virginity, it doesn't as much. And so he has to figure out a way of still supporting virginity, but not in the way that the nuns are doing it. And of course, he'll then blame he blames the nuns, but he also blames the monks and the priests for being a danger to the nuns too. And so again, this virginity is very precarious because they have these horrible Catholic priests and clergy around them who are going to help them to fall. So it just, they're weakened in every way by it, and the celibate clergy are part of the problem.
So you're saying that there's no kind of special spiritual gain attached to celibacy?
In Luther's mind, no, not at all. No, and so I mean, all the arguments that are for celibacy, like you can focus on God more, or that you are there more for your congregation. Luther and Calvin, they all dismiss that it's actually better you can understand your congregation better because you go through the same things they do. God, and you're much more useful to society because it's better. I mean, it's famous quote: "It's better for a father to be changing a diaper than to be a priest or a monk in a monastery." And so he has a very utilitarian way of looking at the clergy and at men and women, and that the spiritual things that the Catholic clergy do, this praying for you, you don't need the clergy to pray for you. You pray yourself for God. You don't need an intermediary, and so that just rips away any of the spiritual power that monks, nuns, or the secular clergy have.
He rejects the regular clergy. So
yeah.
That's the
whole... No, he rejects all clergy. I mean, he doesn't. First, he says we don't need clergy at all, and that we can all just be with God. And then later on, he's like, we know, no, we need clergy. We need clergy. But they're educators, they're leaders. They're not spiritually above us.
Any other questions for Dr. Leonard?
I got one more.
I tell you what, we'll go, George, make it quick, and then we'll go to Ben, because.
The only other question I had was there any kind of alternative Protestant discourse to this kind of Luther Calvin stance on female virginity?
That's basically what I'm looking at now. So I started, I mean, Luther's easy. I mean, it's just, first off, I can't get to archives or anything like that. I mean, all of Luther's online. It's very easy to read, and he writes about everything, and Calvin too. And so that is part of what I'm going to have a whole chapter on the discourse of the Reformers. But I just started with Luther because, I needed to write an article on him, so I did it. But yeah, so I don't know yet, and that'll be really interesting. Of, is this what I see as a very complex hierarchy of virginity or tripartite thing? Is that what everybody's doing, or is that, so far everything I've read is more the precariousness of it. I don't have as sophisticated a view as Luther, and so I'm kind of assuming that's the way it's going to be. I'm actually writing an article on Calvin and virginity over the summer, so I'll know a little bit more about him. But he doesn't write as much on these kinds of things as Luther does, but their sermons are very illustrative for where this is. I want to look at sermons across the board and what are others saying.
And
I've been having some internet problems, so I'm sorry if the question I ask is something that you've already addressed in your talk, because I missed some important bits of it. I visited a nunnery. It was a Cistercian nunnery in Spain a few years ago, and it was a very curious experience. I was visiting with some friends, and one of their family members was a nun. And we went to visit this nun, and there we sat in a room, and there was a sort of like a window that we looked through and spoke with the nun. And there was obviously tremendous pride in the family that this nun had been in there since the 1950s and hadn't really emerged at all. And I don't know what she felt about it. It's obviously difficult to get a sense of that, but certainly the family felt that this was a real, wonderful piece of religiosity within the family. And it was an odd sort of performance of seclusion that I realize it's not just about virginity, but that was clearly part of it, that she'd been secluded from family life and so on. And I visited one or two monasteries with male monks in them, and I've never encountered anything like that before. That obviously the monks are secluded in the sense that one doesn't go and wander around the cloisters necessarily, but equally you can be in physical proximity with the monks. Now, it seemed that this experience with the nun actually fitted quite well with what you were saying with your 16th and 17th century examples, that this was a way of them saying that, virginity and seclusion is something to be proud of. This is something that we do well. This is our identity. But then you read this late medieval polemics, and as if these nuns are with men all the time, isn't it? They're all pregnant, they've all got lovers in the town and so on. Do you think if one went to a monastery in the 15th century, a nunnery rather, you'd find this same performance of seclusion, and it would feel different from going into a monastery with male monks in it?
Absolutely, and I love a question that I really know about, and I did not talk about this in this paper, but that has to do with enclosure, and so it's a huge topic of monastic enclosure, and the fact that early on it's supposed to be for both men and women. Monks take a vow of enclosure as well. They're not supposed to leave the monastery without permission. They're not supposed to have people come in, but it never defines their experience or their existence the way it does for nuns. And so cloistered nuns have to take this vow that they are dead to the world and they can't have anybody come in and see them. So it's both passive and active. Active means they can never leave the cloister. Passive means no one can come in and see them, even their family, unless there's some really a special dispensation. They in German, it's called the Redefenster. It's the talking window. And so that's the grill that they have to speak through, even to their father confessor, and that this defines their life. And it's absolutely performative. I mean, they have these high walls, they have these gates, they have, like the two oldest nuns in the convent are the ones who had the keys to the gate so that no one can get out or in. And the people outside can hear them singing. And so they have this presence in town, even though they're not seen. And of course, then there are all these stories about, well, what's going on behind, if you've read Boccaccio, I mean, so, what's going on behind these walls and why can't we get in? And I wrote a whole thing, this is part of this topic as well, of that convents are often accused of being brothels. And part of it is that brothels and convents are similar, of these, these places where you don't really, nefarious things are going on inside. Now, the thing about enclosure, which lots of people have worked on, is that it's never complete. And so this is the notion that, yes, we're dead to the world, but that's never true. And women are always going around it, having people in, going out, doing reform things. I mean, they never follow it completely. And it's a big battle of the Counter-Reformation, which is trying desperately to define nuns as only enclosed in cloisters. And so all of these, like the Ursulines, who want to be a teaching order outside, or Mary Ward, who wants to have a Jesuit-like order and be missionary and stuff. The Catholic Church is like, no, the only thing are enclosed nuns behind walls, because, and this is going to be part of my book, because their virginity is so precarious and they have to be protected by these walls. And so again, that's what I'm saying, is that the Protestant discourse of virginity, you hear a lot of the same thing on the Catholic side, but they still think that it has power as a spiritual virginity. And that's, again, the women themselves are like, we can be virgins and nuns and be outside the convent and be able to do this. Teresa of Avila, she travels all around. She's very public, founding her own convents, and gets criticized for it, because it's like, you're supposed to be enclosed, and yet she becomes a saint. So there's a lot of contradiction and a lot of similarities between Catholics and Protestants, and that's men. And I do think that that's important. And the men who are talking about this life, the women who live it, have a very different way of talking about it, which is why I have this notion of active virginity that the women embrace, and men just don't understand.
Catherine.
Well, I should say that I am an Americanist, so a lot of this is just, new and interesting. Though I will say that in the 1840s and the 1850s, American Protestants are saying exactly the same thing about convents, and they're like, yeah, it's full of Irish Catholics who are, engaging in illicit sex, right?
Right. No, Catholicism is used, to attack what's going on in the convents, and that they're like brothels and stuff. So it's
a tried and true. It always works. I guess my question may be something you're kind of teasing out, and you're not quite sure yet, but I'd be really interested to hear about it, where, you're talking about virginity as kind of a category of thought that different folks are approaching, because they're kind of trying to figure out how to deal with women, period. Like, what do we think about what women are in a society? And like, we're arguing about that. And so the way we argue about that is how we think about virginity. And clearly the women themselves know that that's exactly the nature of the debate, because they're like, yeah, no, let's talk about where we are in the class hierarchy. And like, we understand that like we have access to certain forms of discourse about virginity that poor women don't. Good for us. Like, I get to run something. Yes. So do you have any kind of, I don't know, what is your sort of overall thought about, like, what do you think is it that they're unable to separate women from sexuality, which would not be shocking at all, so that's just why this is sort of the fingernail under the tape that they have? Or is there like a broader conversation about women in general, in which sexuality has a big part, but that, what's sort of the terms of the debate?
Yeah. I mean, so much of the Reformation, and the more I'm doing this, the more I'm really seeing it. And, you know, Lyndall Roper says the Reformation is about a theology of gender. And I think that's true. And I think that, I mean, especially for German cities and stuff, of that, this very kind of male guild way of wanting to remake society. But I think this sexuality side and the importance of marriage and the way of thinking about patriarchy and stuff, I think I'm coming to see that as more important. And I do think, I mean, women, you know, women cannot be separated from their sexuality. I'm teaching a class right now on women and gender in early modern Europe, and over again, it's like, we're defined by our sexuality. That is, you know, everything about it. You know, you're a whore or you're a Madonna, you know, get married and get protected, all of that. And so I think that you can't separate out the sexuality from where women should be with gender norms, with society, with patriarchy, all of that, that is really getting reinscribed even more and more. And I think that part of it is, this is a period where, you know, people like Luther and others, they're talking a lot about public and private, and that women should be in the private sphere and men can be in the public sphere. Those spheres don't exist yet. And so this idea that there is some private domestic sphere that women will be away from and not be out at market or working in the shop with their husband or doing all these things is just ridiculous. And I think that that's causing anxiety. And I think that there's this way of like, we really want to categorize people because the 16th century is all about categorizing things. You know, from religion to gender to race. I mean, all these things are happening, and it's difficult to know where to put women, and it's difficult to know where to put women because they're so defined by Eve, by this sexual nature, and so and I really do think it's going to be the core of what I'm trying to get at in this book, of like how is this new view of sexuality and where does virginity fit into it? Is that really a guiding force in some way of a huge aspect of the Reformation? And I really think it is. And I think it's happening for Catholics as well. And I think their fear about enclosure, you know, you have this very active public, you know, mission going on with Jesuits and others. And you're saying at the same time, women can't do that. And so even though we want to go and convert the world, and even though we want to fight against Protestants, women can't do that. And that's really actually different from what people were doing in the Middle Ages. And so this is a period where things are shutting down on women in a way. I mean, Hildegard actually had more power and authority back in the 12th century than many nuns are going to have. I mean, she was an aberration, just as Teresa of Avila is. But yeah, I mean, that women are losing rights in the 16th century, particularly in Germany. And I think that, you know, sexuality, gender, marriage, patriarchy, and virginity are all a part of that. And I'm trying to figure out, like, how conscious is it of what Luther's writing and others of that they can use this as a way to control women, or is it just, this is what I believe and I'm writing it? And I mean, teasing that out is going to be impossible probably, but I'm trying.
That is, I don't know, should I say that's cool? Like I'm
happy to hear that's cool. Good. No, that keeps me going.
Let's say I think it's fascinating, but objectively bad that's
right. No, the study is cool. What's happening is not cool, clearly.
Hey, Ray, if you've texted that you have a question here, I'll turn to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Amy. That was a very interesting talk. I've been looking at what goes on in France in the 18th century and the Revolution, where there's also obviously a lot of talk and image about some of the same issues. Let's see. The thing I was wondering when the German about the German Reformation and its attitude toward female, basically convents, and that female religious vocation, is this: in France in the 18th century, convents were used by families to house, to like put away women, daughters whose existence caused problems for like family marital strategies as a whole. And thus the kind of the Lutheran or whole Protestant abolition of female religious establishments would have had massive consequences on the family strategies and thus the whole social life of wherever they were abolished. you know, if you take away that option, what do you do with your 3 or 4 daughters? You know, and so did anyone talk about the consequences or that issue?
Yes, and there are two things there. I mean, the first one is that I should make very clear. I mean, most women don't choose to enter the convent, and I sort of mentioned that, but then kind of sped by it. No, I mean, your family decides to put you in there, and it puts you in there often when you're very young. You know, you just, you know, later on, you figure out whether or not you have a vocation or not. This is true for everybody in this society. People don't choose their careers. They don't choose, you know, oftentimes you don't choose who you marry. You know, you follow what your family tells you to do. So, so yes, this idea is this sort of, you know, this empowering aspect of it. You're lucky if it becomes that once you're in. But no, I mean, the exact same as France in the 18th century is that this is part of family planning. This is part of things you do to keep the name going or not, to not have to pay too much of a dowry. You put, you know, your excess daughters in the convent. I mean, this is a huge thing in Italy, where like some huge percentage of Florence are actually nuns. And so this is actually part of what my first book was about, of that in Strasbourg, where I studied. When they try to close the convents, these nuns are like, where are we going to go? Then, you know, we're old, or we're sick, or, you know, we're teaching your kids, we're doing this useful thing. We have nowhere to go. You can't close us, and they don't. And so the pragmatic purposes of the convent, which Luther says, you know, he's fine with, as long as it's not a spiritual house. The pragmatic purposes of the convent always are a part of what's going on. And that's one of the reasons that almost 50% of female convents in Protestant areas in Germany survive the Reformation, as opposed to 10 to 20% of the male ones, because these women I mean, it's not just they can't go anywhere, they're relatives of the people on the councils, they have familial ties in the way the men don't. And they also have very good arguments where they say, we are your poor daughters and cousins and mothers, and you can't kick us out. Where will we go? But that, you know, the utilitarian purpose of the convent survives. And in fact, in some places, they turn into Protestant houses and still do the same thing, because you still need those. And that's, you know, what happens. And I've read, the work about that in France. Of you know, the elites need these houses, want these houses, and so we'll continue to support them even if they don't care about the religious aspect. And in the 18th century, when you have Diderot writing about, you know, what's going on and all the sexual stuff in convents and things. So yeah, I mean, it continues on. It's a classic trope.
Do you have any other questions? By the way, I just wanted to mention, I absolutely love the image of the lay sisters and the other sisters, but I was really drawn to the idea of the colonial sphere, where the Spanish are kind of debuting new racial hierarchies in the convents, where you have, you know, the white sisters and the brown sisters, and it's just, and I'm like, wow, this looks remarkably similar to images I've seen from like Peru.
Funny, because I was just teaching on this week, and my TA was laughing here. And so using the cast of pictures and then the pictures in the convent and who's on top, and I actually used, you know, and so that, you know, there's a racial hierarchy that happens in the Americas, of that you can't be a choir nun if you're not white European. So.
Okay, well, if you would all please join me in one more round of applause, either with the clap function here. This was an absolute pleasure. This was really the highlight of our speaker series. I'm not going to be troublemaking and ask when the book will be coming out. I will instead just say that we eagerly look forward to it, and we're very grateful that you joined us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun. I love talking about this stuff. So thank you all for coming.
Take care. Take care, everybody.